coming up.
On October 24th, 2024, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Chris Alexander came before this committee and accused me of being a traitor to my country. Hiding behind a cloak of parliamentary privilege, he falsely claimed that I had been recruited as a Russian spy in the 1980s and suggested I am still working as a Russian agent. His preposterous claims were based on several pieces of paper he told you had been examined by experts around the world.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
The committee resumes its study of Russian interference and disinformation campaigns in Canada. And I would like to now welcome our witnesses. As an individual, David Pugliese, journalist of the Ottawa Citizen, welcome. And Canadian Association of Journalists President Brent Joly.
I had no intention of appearing before this committee, but when my reputation and profession was attacked, I felt compelled to offer some truth and balance to your discussion.
I'm joining you here today as the president of the Canadian Association of Journalists, which is an organization that has existed since 1978, so more than 45 years, to represent the interests of journalists, to undertake advocacy and support the public's right to know.
Thank you very much for your remarks. We will now start our rounds of questions. Each individual will have 6 minutes. Mr. Shipley, you're up first.
And since we are studying Russian disinformation, do you have any thoughts on how the government can address Russia's use of disinformation and information manipulation? Obviously, you're living through it right now. Maybe you can give us your opinion on that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think these committees have to be very careful at looking at the evidence that's being presented.
For 10 years, Russia's been invading Europe's largest state. A full-scale onslaught began in 2022, as you all know, challenging the alliance's institutions and principles Canada fought 2 world wars to uphold. Moscow's genocidal war of aggression recalls the horrors of Hitler and Stalin, yet we've still not committed fully to defeating this aggressor or to Ukraine's victory. Now, why is that? Part of the answer is Russian disinformation, Russian active measures, Russian interference. According to Jakub Kalinski, Deputy Director of the Community of Interest on Hybrid Threats at Europe's Center of Excellence in Helsinki, Russia produces over 60% of disinformation worldwide and 80% in Europe. Its main vectors of distribution are still social media platforms, as Meta recently confirmed to you. But gray zone media, influencers, and other proxies, as well as state propaganda outlets like Russia Today, are also major threat actors. They torque debates and magnify niche conflicts into societal breakdowns. On Twitter X, the owner himself regurgitates Kremlin talking points and rolls out the red carpet for Russian and other state-sponsored bots. No, Meta, TikTok, YouTube, and other platforms are definitely not doing enough. We still have no idea how much Russian, Chinese, and Iran-backed spending influences our politics or our elections. Meanwhile, unregulated promotion of political extremism and polarization has tipped newsrooms across Canada into freefall, causing a dangerous loss of self-awareness in local communities and national debates. Far from being marginal players, Russian information assets and active measures are often kingmakers in our elections. In other words, to prevent Ukraine's victory, Russia is investing heavily in propaganda, political, and cognitive warfare to ensure we never make the military commitments needed to win. Let me give you 2 Canadian examples. One past, one present. Over 2018-19, the anti-immigration People's Party of Canada, the Yellow Vests movement, trucker protests, and Wexit all began. Then COVID hit. By early 2022, truckers were blockading Ottawa and several border crossings. You know the history. To be clear, these protests did attract ordinary people with genuine grievances over vaccine mandates, but the ringleaders and extremists that joined them had been radicalized, many of them online, by Moscow-backed active measures. Their funding came from shadowy corners of the MAGA demi-monde, even as far away as Bulgaria, and had all the hallmarks of Russian influence. The blockade's timing coincided with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Attempts to replicate these convoys, some successful, took place in every NATO country, as well as Australia and New Zealand. Russian state propaganda promoted the story relentlessly. Russia Today did 250 reports on Canada's protests alone. What was Moscow's motive? To distract the country with a huge Ukrainian diaspora as the Kremlin launched its war of aggression. Did it work? In a word, yes. We continue to underestimate Moscow's strategic ambition. Beyond reconquering Ukraine, they want to disrupt and destabilize democracies, roll back American and allied influence, and break the EU and NATO. They sow discord and erode trust with anti-immigrant, xenophobic, anti-LGBTQ, anti-West, and anti-women campaigns, as well as hate speech, separatism, and disinformation about elections or health issues, as the truckers' blockade, the Yellow Vest movement, the PPC, Wexit, the anti-vax movements, pro-Hamas protests, and many extreme elements that play into elections in Canada and in allied democracies have shown us. 7 documents tabled before you originate in the pre-1991 archives of the Ukrainian KGB. And now I'm on to the second issue, which relates to a current matter. They are in the hands of Canadian national security officials because they are evidence of a serious effort to undermine Canada's national security and collective self-defense. They've also been authenticated by several of the world's leading experts on KGB documents. In a nutshell, these records document a KGB operation to talent spot, recruit, develop, and run as an agent a Canadian citizen who's been a prominent journalist in this country for over 3 decades. His code name in these KGB files was Stuart. His recruiter, handler, and paymaster over the period discussed here from 1982 to 1990 was another agent, codenamed Ivan. Some of the world's leading experts on KGB documents have attested to their authenticity. If Stewart continued as an agent after 1990, as there's now every reason to believe he did, we have no access to those files because they're in Moscow. These documents illustrate the challenge our democracies face. For decades, Moscow has been recruiting and paying policymakers, influencers, politicians, journalists, and others to act as their proxies, to undermine trust in our institutions, to dissipate our political will. Even at the height of so-called glasnost, when so many believed Moscow's imperialism and global subversion campaigns had ended, such recruitment was still happening. The agent described in these documents was an illegal, working for Directorate S of the KGB's first main directorate, which has the same name and purpose in Russia's External Intelligence Service, or SVR today, as Mikhail Mikushin and the Vavilovs previously did in Canada, as well as the 10 illegal agents arrested and expelled from the US in 2010. This journalist has been prolific, publishing as many as 100 or 200 articles per year in Canada and the US since 1990. His recent subjects are instructive. Countless stories about Ukraine's Nazi links or Nazis in Canada, defamatory pieces about the family of Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, provocative takes on procurement and other issues at the Department of National Defence and in the Canadian Forces. In short, these are themes that Moscow would be delighted to promote. They also aim to weaken Canadian support for Ukraine. Previous efforts to expose this journalist's long-running covert ties to Moscow have resulted in attempts to intimidate current and former Canadian parliamentarians, including my former colleague James Bazan, as well as Canadian Army officers. Canadians need and deserve quality, independent journalism now more than ever. We need to bolster our national security and defense and to back Ukraine's victory fully. Moscow's information war, its active measures, and continuing espionage are a serious hindrance to all of this. In 1945, the Guzenko revelations resulted in a royal commission that turned Canada into one of the Cold War's most reliable allies. I call upon you, the Foreign Interference Commission, our governments, intelligence, security, and law enforcement agencies at all levels to work together to end the impunity with which Russia has operated in Canada. We need to acknowledge, assess, and attribute active measures, disinformation, influence operations, and other malign activities that originate in Moscow, and act to disrupt and prevent such activities and hold the perpetrators to account. Merci beaucoup.
Mr. Alexander, great to see you again and having you here. You worked in Moscow as deputy head of mission for the Canadian Embassy, is that right? You are fluent in Russian?
Yes.
Have you, these documents that you've dropped on the table today are quite disturbing. Have you been able to get that authenticized as being true to fact?
Yes. Not just myself. I've been aware of the documents and able to read them for many months. I'm not sure exactly how many months it's been. They have been shared with, as I mentioned, national security authorities in Canada and I believe other jurisdictions. And many hands, not just mine, have gone to the people they know in the world of expertise around KGB documents to authenticate them.
So in December 2023, I covered a Senate Fisheries Committee. And I watched a so-called disinformation expert who works for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which Mr. Alexander works for. And this individual made a link between the Russians and Vladimir Putin and Ryan Reynolds, the Canadian actor. So Putin and the Russians have put out disinformation about the Canadian seal hunt. Ryan Reynolds is an animal activist, and he has put out a documentary about the Canadian seal hunt, which hasn't been complimentary. And so I watched this committee, this disinformation expert, link Ryan Reynolds and Putin together. And so I came away from that, and, words, as a committee member has mentioned, are very important. And if Ryan Reynolds can be linked to the Russians and Russian disinformation, then no Canadian will be safe from any such smears.
Thank you for that. Mr. Jolly, I'd like to ask you a question next, if I could. You mentioned that your organization was started in 1978, which is 45 years. Have you ever seen a case like this in journalism, and how have your association reacted to it, or what have you done to prevent this, the disinformation side of it going forward, of your journalists?
Absolutely. I mean, this is quite different in its own right. The fact that it was asserted by a former cabinet minister in a standing committee of, a democratically operated organization. I think that is something that really takes the cake. But I think we also need to be really aware of the challenges that journalists are facing out in the field every day in covering, protests and injunction zones. We've seen, photojournalists who are having their access restricted when they're trying to go out and cover wildfires in BC or in Alberta. These are all part and parcel. This is part of the shrinking, press freedom environment that we're seeing. And I think what Mr. Pugliese has experienced is certainly part and parcel with it. It does sort of give me a sense of exasperation, the degree to which these accusations were made, again, within the context of a committee. I think it was a really bad look.
Thank you. The time is up, and we'll go to Ms. O'Connell.
In Mr. Alexander's opening remarks, he said, quote, "Previous efforts to expose this journalist's long-running covert ties to Moscow has resulted in attempts to intimidate current and former Canadian parliamentarians, including my former colleague James Bazan, as well as Canadian Army officials," end quote. Are you aware of any of those efforts? Again, this testimony, I'd served on a committee with Mr. Bazan on national defense. I have never heard these accusations. Do you have any idea where that is coming from or why this was presented that day?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So when I heard that, I thought we're entering into a territory of unhinged testimony. I couldn't believe it. So I don't know Mr. Bazan. He has used information from my articles and raised it in the House of Commons to hold the government to account, which is fine. In 2018, I wrote an article, in fact, supporting Mr. Bazan when a senior Canadian Forces public affairs officer by the name of Colonel Jay Jansen was dictating to Mr. Bazan on social media on what he should, as a parliamentarian, ask. And so I did an article quoting Mr. Bazan, and this isn't a proper, parliamentarians shouldn't be told what they can be asking in Parliament. When I heard that, I was just flabbergasted. It was, it's crazy. I don't want to get into too many details where I live now, but I don't live in Ottawa. I live 5,000 miles away, and I've never intimidated Mr. Bazan. I don't know what that is about, or any other Canadian Forces officers.
Have you ever published a story where the Kremlin was your source? I'm sorry, but I want the opportunity on the record.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. So, no, I have never published a story where the Kremlin was my source. I have done one interview with the spokesman from the Russian embassy who is given the boot from Canada, and that was published. Most of my sources are Canadian Forces records, that I acquire through the Access to Information Law, Canadian Forces statements, and Canadian Forces personnel usually coming to me for help because they're getting, for want of a better word, jerked around by the chain of command. And if you follow most of my stories, you'll see that those are stories that I
you, Mr.
do a lot of.
Like, do you have any further thoughts on just, like what you think might have prompted Mr. Alexander to go down this? Like, can you search your memory for in any way that you might have crossed paths, affected him personally? I mean, I know as parliamentarians, it's the nature of the job to sometimes feel the rough edge of the press. That's a normal part of public service. But yeah, this.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what struck me is Mr. Alexander seemed very upset by my journalism. So he's upset that I report about these procurements that go offline. And, for me, that's just reporting on where our tax dollars are going. So I don't understand that, what that big issue is. Now, I'll give you an example of like some of the things that people have accused me of doing, like Russian disinformation. So last year, Canadian forces were training Ukrainian troops in Poland. And the troops were not getting paid their allowances for their food. That was causing problems back home in the families because then, there's less money. The spouses of these soldiers approached me, told me the story, and asked me if I could write a story. I wrote a story. It was brought up in the House of Commons. And like a week and a half later, these soldiers started getting their pay. But this appears to be, and then I started getting emails saying, well, you're embarrassing Canada, you're helping the Russians, gee, this is Russian disinformation. And so my response to this is, reporting on this type of thing, it's not Russian disinformation. If you don't want the Russians to use this information, then pay the soldiers properly. So that is the issue here, and not everything is Russian disinformation because it might embarrass the Canadian forces or the government of the day. And the sense I got from him, he seemed very perturbed about my reporting.
And just like speaking of Russian disinformation, you've probably heard that in our last meeting we had Miss Lauren Chen here as a witness. And she and her husband and her company, Tenant Media, are named in a U.S. indictment as having been the recipients of several $1 million from Russia today. We asked her a lot of questions, and she came back with the same standard answer. But just for you as a journalist who does all of this incredible investigative work, just talk a little bit about the challenges when you're dealing with social media companies that don't have journalistic standards and practices, no internal code of ethics that guide how they report on truthful events.
Sure. I mean, thank you, Madam Chairman. So,
just a brief
as
response,
much as people,
please, Mr. Pugliese, just a brief answer, please.
Dislike my journalism, you have a place to go. So the Ottawa Citizen, you can complain to my editor. You can take me to the National Press Press Council and file a complaint. With these other organizations, you can't. And so that is the difference between myself and some of these other entities you're running into.
Thank you, Mr. Pugliese.
The one thing I pride myself
our time is
is
up on this round. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Sorry.
Time is up in this round.
Okay.
Perhaps Mr. Lloyd will allow you to finish your comments there. I apologize for interrupting. Mr. Lloyd, you have 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will say at the outset that the meeting where these allegations were made was very bizarre, and not having adequate time to review these documents before really minimized the opportunity to really focus in on them. And so I'm going to actually take that opportunity right now to go into these documents and ask you some questions. The documents, which I assume you've read the documents, Mr. Pugliese, the documents first appears to be written in about August or September of 1984, and it says the subject, Stuart, was permanently residing in Ottawa at the time. Were you residing in Ottawa in 1984?
Madam Chairman, no, I was not residing in Ottawa at that time.
Okay, thank you for that. In a later document, it says that in 1989 and 1990, the subject Stewart began active work at the Ottawa Citizen newspaper. Is that the time that you began active work at the Ottawa Citizen?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yeah, that is correct, and that information is available online. Just to add, the documents also stated, one of the other documents also stated in 1988 I was permanently in Ottawa. That is false.
Says in another document, born and residing in Canada, student activist. Were you a student activist?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. No, I wasn't a student activist.
And the reason I'm asking this is these are very specific things.
Sure,
and,
sure.
you know, if somebody's putting this together, they must have done some research in with you. Wouldn't you agree that the best disinformation always has an element of truth in it?
I would agree, except this time they didn't seem to do a very good job.
Yeah.
You know, like as I mentioned previously, student activist. Well, if you take a look at my writings, you know, at one point in the 80s, I was writing for a Canadian Armed Forces journal, or a Canadian Armed Forces publication. So
those are kind of hotbeds for communists, those armed forces journals?
Yeah, no, so the my work in the 1980s would not be described as an op-ed for communists. They would probably be described as pro-military, pro-NATO, anti-Russian, anti-Soviet.
Another part of the document here says that the subject Stewart expressed a loyal attitude towards Soviet Union policy. Have you had a loyal attitude towards the Soviet Union's policy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I have not had any pro-Soviet attitudes.
Do you think that looking at Russia as it is today versus what Russia was in the time of the Soviet Union, do you think that it's even ideologically consistent for somebody who was loyal to the Soviet Union to necessarily be loyal to what the current iteration of the Russian state looks like?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, the Soviet Union from the 1980s it could be arguably described as far, far different than what's going on in Russia right now. I don't have the, I don't have the knowledge, but they're totally two different entities.
Given that you've had access to these documents, have you had an opportunity to send them off for verification or to be, debunked by a third party? Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I mean, the committee was given photocopies, I believe, so it's hard to send photocopies off. And quite frankly, I view the documents as ridiculous.
Yeah. I just find it, I don't think Mr. Alexander came up with these documents on his own, so obviously somebody put together these documents. Do you have any idea of who might have put together these documents and what their motivations might have been?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can't get into details. However, I am in the midst of a civil lawsuit for $7 million that, you know what, I think our lawyer would prefer that I don't go further into that. But,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you think we can improve resilience against foreign influence in a way that doesn't compromise press freedom?
That's a good point. I think you have to go through a prism of, you have to carefully look at what's being presented. Just because I write an article about sexual assault in the Canadian Forces, oh, sorry.
I'm so sorry to cut you off. The time is up.
So earlier this week, our committee heard testimony from Lauren Chen, the founder of Tenet Media, the organization currently at the heart of the U.S. indictment into Russian interference and disinformation. So when accusations like that are thrown against journalists, obviously we live in an environment, thanks in part to our neighbor from the south, where legacy media, mainstream media is constantly criticized and mistrusted. What do you think it's doing in terms of eroding the trust in actual journalists when those kinds of claims are made against legacy media?
Thank you, Madam Chair. we're in a new world when it comes to social media, and anyone can say anything. For instance, there was an individual who obviously had advanced warning about what was going to go down in your committee, who was tweeting 1 hour before you even started that these explosive testimony would happen. About a prominent Canadian journalist. The same individual, the minute that your committee started, popped these documents up on social media. We're in a different world here. So in the 90s, I was accused of being a CIA agent by peace groups. When I was covering the Afghan war, some parliamentarians said I was a Taliban sympathizer. Now fast forward to 2024, I'm a Russian spy. I'm living this exciting life. The difference this time is these allegations against journalists because of social media are just rocket everywhere, and that's the difference. So in the 90s when I'm a CIA agent, that's just coming from a bunch of disarmament groups, but now it's a whole different world.
Chair, how much time do I have? 2 minutes, okay. In your role as a journalist, have you ever spoken with representatives of the Russian embassy in Canada regarding a potential story?
So thank you, Madam Chair. So in my role as a journalist, probably about 8 years ago, I've done 3 stories where the Russian embassy is quoted. So 2 emailed statements, which were put in the story, and then the main story, which is a telephone conversation with the Russian embassy spokesman who was booted out of Canada by the Liberal government. So that was a voice interview.
Great, thank you. So we know that when testifying before our committee, Rachel Curran, Meta's lobbyist and former director of policy to Stephen Harper, said that Meta had to remove news from Facebook and Instagram in Canada because under the Online News Act, they would be forced to pay approximately $80 million a year. And I quote, content that had no particular commercial value to us, end quote. For those keeping track at home, last year Meta made $134 billion in revenue. $80 million is 0.05% of Meta's annual revenue. Do you think that 0.05% of revenue, which is a rounding error, is it too much to ask global tech giants to pay for Canadian news?
I can answer that. Absolutely not. I think Meta's actions in the wake of the Online News Act were cowardly. I think they backed away as soon as possible because they understood that there was going to be a lot of potential liabilities based on what was going on in the United States, in the election that just took place. And so they didn't really want to be in that game. And it became a question of dollars and cents, and it didn't matter to them. I mean, I think that reflects the public service mandate or their interest in serving the public. So, I mean, 0.5% rounding error. I'm biased. I'm a journalist.
And that's all the time we have in this round.
Fair enough.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Gahir.
We've been looking at representatives from the whole spectrum, including our national security and intelligence agencies. But from your perspective, because you are knee-deep in this every single day with your profession, what kind of recommendations would you like to see in our report to the federal government in things that the federal government could concretely do to stop our foreign adversaries from sowing this kind of discord?
Yeah, I noticed. Thank you for the question. I noticed I was watching back some of the previous committee meetings just to kind of get a sense of where things were and get up to speed. And I particularly appreciated the idea behind some of the Scandinavian countries to ensure information resilience and public literacy on this. I think, that is something that I see every day is people don't understand the difference between a news report and an opinion article. Like even that, those are two completely different things, but for some reason that all sort of gets lumped into one because, it appeared in the Ottawa Citizen or whatever. And, it's all one and the same in people's view. And I think, journalists are by their nature storytellers. And I think we do a pretty abysmal job of telling our own story. What do we do? Why are we here? What is the purpose of journalists in a functioning democratic society. And I think if we can distill that, that's a real win. Now, for what this committee can do, and I mean, it's provincial jurisdiction because God bless Canada and federalism, but information literacy, media literacy, news literacy curriculums, opportunities for that, that's where it's at.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to the last round, which, colleagues, I will shorten by 1 minute just to keep us on time, so that we have 2 4-minute rounds. Mr. Motz, go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you to be here, witnesses. I appreciate you coming here. Now, given the information that you've shared with committee members and on your testimony, you have steps that you take to maintain journalistic integrity. So could you kind of explain, and from both of you, how do you go about doing that to unknowingly, spread potential disinformation from any foreign actor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I approach my journalism from a lot of it is record-based. So when a Canadian Forces person comes to me and says, this is happening to me, the first thing I say is, please provide me with your records. And usually they give me a lot of records. And so, personnel reports or access to information, privacy reports, official government documents. Then I go to the Department of National Defense, and so there's a checks and balance issue here. And so I say, this individual is saying this, and Department of National Defense will come back. Usually they'll say, yes, that's happening. And I'll say, please comment, and away we go.
Okay, well, thank you, and I appreciate that. I know, so basically, to summarize, you ask for documentation, and then, you source your sources.
Correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. So from a broader Canadian perspective, so based on both your experiences, what indicators should Canadians be looking for and watching out for to identify potential disinformation campaigns originating from any foreign hostile state?
There's a sense of critical thinking above all, I think, is the most foundational ingredient to be able to debunk ridiculousness like we just saw here. And it heartens me to hear that, after the committee's had a chance to think through it or review the documents, that, they don't really, pass muster.
I'm going to ask you to repeat that. Your mic wasn't on at the front end. You mentioned, so it's not going to show up for Canadians to hear. You said Canadians should employ critical thinking.
Absolutely. We need Canadians to be able to decipher truth, from falsehood. Critical thinking is foundational, and I don't know where we're going to be able to do that. I think the point about the education system, but we have 13, every province and territory, but we're not teaching that, and that's
the literacy is important.
Absolutely, it's a core principle, just like mathematics is, just like an understanding of how biology works. You are navigating. People are on their smartphones right now. You are engaging in an environment where there is warfare going on right now, and you need to have the tools to be able to fight back against that. And if you don't, if you come with twigs and figs or something, you're gonna lose, and you're gonna see misinformation and disinformation campaigns. You're going to see things like we saw down the street here a couple of years ago with the Freedom Convoy and all kinds of, deleterious social things. So immunize.
Thank you very much. I appreciate both of your testimonies. Madam Chair, if I could, in the seconds that I have left, I'd like to move a motion about this study, if I could. And it is as follows. That once the committee has conducted 8 meetings on the study of Russian interference and disinformation campaigns in Canada, the committee proceed to the following matters in order. Number 1, the committee concurrently undertakes allotting alternating meetings of not fewer than 6 meetings each. Its agreed upon study on the rise in violent crime and a study examining how addressing gaps in community mental health and substance use health supports, including preventative and early intervention services, can improve public safety in Canada, that both the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions be invited
to testify separately for 1 hour each on this study, that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive report or response to the report. And then lastly, number 2, the committee invite the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Immigration to appear before the committee as soon as possible pursuant to the motion passed on September 19th, 2024.